I'd been with NRCS for 11 years when I transferred to the Monticello field office in San Juan County, Utah. The job was rangeland management specialist, which, for anyone unfamiliar, means I spent most of my time driving dirt roads between grazing allotments, meeting with ranchers, and writing conservation plans that balanced livestock use against what the land could actually sustain. I'd worked stations in eastern Montana and western Nebraska before, but this was different country. Cedar Mesa sandstone, pinyon juniper woodland, and a landscape so deeply incised by canyons that you could drive the benchlands all morning and never realize the ground was falling away 1,000 feet just a quarter mile off the road. If you spend enough time telling stories about what happens in places like this, places that don't conform to the usual categories, I'd encourage you to subscribe to this channel. What we try to do here is follow evidence carefully, without exaggerating, and share what we find with people who take the land seriously. That's the only promise I'll make. My transfer came through in early March of 2025. I was replacing a specialist named Dale Hyatt, who had retired the previous November after 23 years in the same office. Dale was a San Juan County institution in his own right, born in Blanding, educated at Utah State, and connected to every ranching family from the Abajo Mountains to the San Juan River. In most NRCS offices, a new specialist gets a week of overlap with the outgoing person. I got nothing. Dale's retirement had been sudden. The official explanation was a medical issue, and I didn't press anyone for details. His files were comprehensive, his conservation plans were well documented, and the permit holders I'd be working with had been notified. On paper, everything was in order. The field office occupied a low brick building on Main Street in Monticello, shared with the Farm Service Agency. My counterpart there was a woman named Teresa Quintero, who handled crop insurance and emergency loan programs. Teresa had been in the office for 6 years and knew the county's agricultural operations as well as anyone. She was the first person to mention the White Canyon. It happened during my second week while I was reviewing Dale's allotment maps. The Monticello field office covered an enormous area, over 2 million acres of mixed BLM, Forest Service, state, and private land. Most of the active grazing allotments were concentrated on the Abajo mountain slopes, the Dry Valley benchlands, and the open range south of Monticello toward the Navajo Nation. But Dale had also maintained files on several allotments that bordered or overlapped with the White Canyon drainage, the deep system of sandstone canyons that runs westward from near Natural Bridges National Monument toward what used to be the upper reaches of Lake Powell. These allotments were large, sparsely stocked, and hadn't been actively reviewed in years. I asked Teresa about them, whether any of the permit holders in that area had been in contact recently, whether there were compliance issues I should prioritize. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "You should probably just talk to Lyle Perkins about those." Lyle Perkins held the grazing permits on 3 allotments south of Highway 95 that included BLM land along the upper White Canyon system. His family had been running cattle in the area since the 1940s. Not one of the big historic operations like Skorup Somerville, but a solid mid-size outfit that had survived the droughts, the market crashes, and the ongoing contraction of the ranching industry in San Juan County. According to Dale's files, Lyle was running about 200 head across those 3 allotments, well within his permitted numbers. His last conservation plan review was dated 2021, and the compliance status was listed as satisfactory. "Is there something I should know before I contact him?" I asked. Teresa hesitated. "Dale would have told you this himself if he'd still been here. Every new person who comes through this office, BLM, NRCS, even the extension folks, someone eventually tells them to be careful about the White Canyon allotments. But no one explains what that actually means. Careful how? That's the thing. I've asked 3 different people. I've gotten 3 different non-answers. The BLM range con told me Lyle is particular about his boundaries. One of the older ranchers in Blanding said the White Canyon country is hard on livestock. And Dale, the one time I asked him directly, said it was best to let Lyle bring things up on his own terms. She paused. I'm not trying to spook you. Lyle's not difficult. The allotment is unusual, and people are vague about why. I called Lyle Perkins that afternoon and introduced myself. He was polite, businesslike, and clearly not surprised by the call. He said he'd been expecting a new specialist and suggested I come out to his place before trying to visit the allotments on my own. The roads down there aren't on any map that's current, he said. And the canyon breaks up fast once you leave the bench. You'd want someone who knows where the fence lines actually are versus where BLM thinks they are. We arranged to meet the following Tuesday at his ranch, which was east of Fry Canyon off a county road that branched south from Highway 95. I spent the intervening days reading Dale's files more carefully. The allotment records were organized by BLM allotment number, cross-referenced with the NRCS conservation plans that governed grazing rotations, stocking rates, and range improvement practices. Dale's fieldwork was meticulous. For most allotments, his notes were clinical and complete: soil types, vegetative transect data, utilization estimates, photo monitoring points, standard work. But the 3 White Canyon allotments designated as Gravel Bench, Fort Knocker South and Long Canyon Rim, had a different character. The data was all present, the plans were all current, but the notes were shorter, more guarded. Where Dale's other files included casual observations, weather on the day of the visit, condition of access roads, conversations with the permit holder, the White Canyon files were stripped to the minimum required information. Reading them felt like reading something that had been edited. One detail stood out. In the 2019 utilization assessment for the Gravel Bench allotment, Dale had recorded a standard satisfactory rating. But in the margin of his field copy, not the version entered into the digital system, he had written a single line in pencil. Ask Lyle about the east pasture. Not again. I didn't know what to make of that. Not again could mean almost anything. A recurring trespass issue, a boundary dispute, a water problem. But the fact that it was only in pencil, only on the field copy, and had no corresponding entry in the official record, made me take note. The drive from Monticello to Lyle's ranch took about an hour and 20 minutes. Highway 191 south to the junction with 95, then west along the Bicentennial Highway through the broad valley below the Abajo foothills, past the turnoff for natural bridges, and into the increasingly spare and fractured landscape of the White Canyon country. The terrain changed gradually. The pinyon juniper woodland thinned. The benchlands widened and the rock beneath them became more visible. Pale cedar mesa sandstone, smooth and undulating, broken by drainage lines that deepened with startling speed into canyons you couldn't see until you were nearly at their rims. Lyle's ranch was marked by a steel gate with no sign, just a mailbox number. The road beyond it crossed a quarter-mile of open ground to a cluster of buildings, a frame house, a metal equipment barn, 2 corrals, and a hay shed. The property was tidy and functional. There were no decorative touches. A blue heeler watched me from the porch but didn't bark. Lyle came out to meet me. He was in his late 60s, lean and sun-weathered in the way that's common to men who've spent their lives working in the desert. He shook my hand firmly and invited me inside. His wife Connie brought coffee. We sat at a kitchen table covered with a clear vinyl cloth, and for the first 20 minutes, we talked about the standard things: my background, the conservation plans, his stocking numbers, the condition of his permitted range. Lyle was articulate and precise. He knew his allotments better than the BLM did. He referenced specific drainage names, soil types, and vegetative benchmarks without consulting any notes. He described his grazing rotation in terms that would have satisfied any range management textbook. I told him his operation looked solid on paper, and I was mainly interested in scheduling the compliance review that was overdue for the Long Canyon Rim allotment. He nodded. "That one's fine. I can take you up there whenever you want. The bench access road is passable this time of year." "What about Fort Knocker South?" "Also fine. A little harder to get to, but we can do both in a day if we start early." "And gravel bench?" Lyle set his coffee down. He didn't look away, and his expression didn't change. But the pause was just long enough that I noticed it. "Gravel bench is the one we should talk about," he said. Connie, who had been washing dishes at the sink, turned the water off. She didn't leave the room, but she stopped what she was doing. "What's the issue?" I said. "There's no issue with the permit," Lyle said. "The stocking rate is right. The utilization is within limits. I've been running cattle on that allotment since I took it over from my father in 1988. And the range condition has improved every decade." Dale confirmed that every time he came out. "Okay." "The issue," Lyle said, "is that I stopped running cattle in the east pasture of that allotment in 2006, almost 20 years ago. And no one at your office or BLM has ever asked me why." I waited. I should say Dale asked. Once. In 2008. I told him the truth, and he never asked again. He adjusted the conservation plan to reflect reduced utilization in that pasture and left it at that. Lyle looked at me steadily. I don't know what he told the office. Probably nothing, based on the fact that no one's followed up. "What did you tell him?" Lyle leaned back in his chair. "I told him my cattle wouldn't stay in that pasture. I told him I'd repaired the fencing 3 times, brought the animals in on horseback, and every time, within 72 hours, they'd pushed through or gone over or found some way out. 200 head of cattle that had used that ground their whole lives suddenly wouldn't stay on it. Wasn't water. It wasn't forage. The grass was as good as anywhere on the allotment. They just left." "All at once? Or gradually?" "Gradually the first time. I thought it was a fence issue. Repaired it, brought them back. The second time was faster, within 2 days. The third time, I trailered them in. Good tight fencing. And they hit the wire so hard, 3 of them got cut up. One heifer tore her shoulder open on a T-post. After that, I pulled them, and I haven't been back. This wasn't an unusual story in the abstract. Cattle avoid areas for reasons: predators, contaminated water, certain toxic plants. Locoweed, larkspur, water hemlock. I said as much. "I know what spooks cattle," Lyle said. "I've been doing this my whole life. My father did it before me. Those animals weren't spooked. Spooked cattle run. These cattle were deliberate. They wanted out of that pasture, and they found a way. Every single time." "Did you ever find evidence of a predator? Mountain lion, bear?" "No. And I looked. Spent 3 days riding that pasture after the first incident. No tracks, no scat, no kills, no sign. I had the vet look at the animals. No bite marks, no claw marks. Just the wire injuries from when they forced through." "What about the vegetation? Could there have been a toxic plant issue you didn't identify?" I considered that. Brought a botanist out from the extension office in 2007, a woman from USU, I forget her name. She walked every acre of that pasture with me. Found nothing unusual. Good forage, standard species composition for cedar mesa benchland. She wrote it up. I have the report somewhere. Connie spoke from the kitchen for the first time. "You should take him out there, Lyle." He looked at her. Something passed between them. Not disagreement, but a weighing. "I've been telling you for years," she said. "If you want anyone to take this seriously, you have to let them see it." Lyle turned back to me. "The pasture is about 3 miles off the nearest road. Canyon access only. You go down into the head of a side drainage and follow it south to where the bench opens up. It's not technical, but it's not a casual walk either. If you're willing, I'll take you out there. I haven't been down in about 4 years, but I know the road." I said I was willing. We scheduled it for the following Friday, weather permitting. I drove back to Monticello, thinking about 2 things. First, that Lyle Perkins was not a man prone to exaggeration. He'd described a practical problem in practical terms, and his response to it, withdrawing the cattle, adjusting his operation, accepting the reduced capacity, was the response of someone who solves problems rather than someone who dramatizes them. Second, that Dale Hyatt had heard this story, made a professional judgment about it, and then systematically minimized it in the record. He'd reduced the utilization numbers without documenting why. He'd kept the marginal note in pencil. He'd told Teresa to let Lyle bring things up on his own terms. Dale hadn't ignored the information. He'd managed it, and in doing so, he'd ensured that no one after him would have the context to understand what the files actually contained. I thought about calling Dale. I had his number from the personnel records. But something about the way Teresa had described his departure, sudden, medical, no transition, made me hesitate. I decided to see the pasture first. The rest of the week, I handled routine work. Compliance reviews on 2 allotments in Dry Valley. A phone consultation with a rancher near Blanding about a stock water development. I pulled the 2007 extension report that Lyle had mentioned. It took some digging, but USU's Extension Archive had a copy. The botanist was Dr. Sarah Wendt. Her report was thorough and unremarkable. Standard rangeland assessment. Good condition class, no invasive species of concern. Adequate water from a seasonal spring in the lower drainage. In her concluding paragraph, she noted, "Mr. Perkins reports livestock avoidance of this pasture beginning in 2006. No vegetative or hydrological explanation was identified during this assessment. Recommend continued monitoring." Continued monitoring. The standard recommendation when you don't find a cause. I'd written those words myself, dozens of times, in different contexts. They were professional language for, I don't know. Friday came clear and warm. I met Lyle at his ranch at 7 in the morning. He'd packed water and food for both of us. We took his truck south on a 2-track that branched off the county road and wound through low pinyon juniper for about 40 minutes before ending at a wide spot in the road where the ground began to break away toward a drainage. From there, we went on foot. The hike down was straightforward but slow. The drainage head was a series of slick rock ledges interspersed with sandy benches, dropping maybe 400 feet over 1.5 miles. Lyle moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. He pointed out old fence posts along the rim, the remains of the original allotment boundary that his father had established in the 1960s. Below us, the drainage deepened and narrowed before opening onto the bench that constituted the east pasture. We reached the bench just after 9. It was a broad, gently sloping expanse of sandy ground, maybe 300 acres, bounded on 3 sides by canyon walls and on the 4th by the main White Canyon drainage, which was dry this time of year. The vegetation was exactly what Dr. Wendt's report described: good stands of Indian rice grass, galeta, and blue grama, with scattered blackbrush and a few young junipers on the higher ground. There was a seasonal spring near the base of the south-facing wall, still showing a trickle of water into a shallow rock basin. The fencing was down in several places, not surprising after years of neglect, but the posts were still standing. It looked like good rangeland. Honestly, it looked better than most of what I'd seen in San Juan County. The vegetation was healthy. The soil surface was intact with good cryptobiotic crust coverage, and the spring, while small, was reliable enough for the stock numbers Lyle had historically run here. "This is it," Lyle said. I did what I always do on a compliance visit. I walked transects, took photographs, noted the GPS coordinates of the monitoring points, and assessed the condition of the improvements: the spring development, the fencing, the old salt station. Everything was consistent with long-term rest. The range had improved in the absence of grazing, which was normal. What I didn't see was any reason for cattle to avoid the area. "I know what it looks like," Lyle said. He was sitting on a flat rock near the spring, eating an apple. "It looks like perfectly good pasture. That's what drove me crazy about it." "Let me ask you something," I said. "When the cattle left all 3 times, which direction did they go?" "North, every time. Back up the drainage toward the bench road. Never south, never toward the canyon rim. Always the direction they came from." "And you said it was deliberate. What did you mean by that?" "I mean, they didn't scatter. They didn't bolt. They moved together, calmly, like they were being trailed out by a rider. Except there was no rider, no dogs, nothing." I finished my transect work, and we ate lunch in the shade of the canyon wall near the spring. The midday sun was intense on the open bench, and the temperature differential between shade and exposure was extreme, and a characteristic of this kind of sandstone environment. The canyon walls radiated heat on one face and held cool air on the other. While we were sitting there, Lyle pointed to the south wall of the canyon, about 200 yards from the spring. "There's something I didn't show Dale," he said. "Or anyone else." I looked where he was pointing. The wall was a typical Cedar Mesa exposure. Pale sandstone, streaked with desert varnish, pockmarked with alcoves and weathering hollows. "See that alcove? The wide one with the dark stain underneath?" I saw it. A shallow alcove about 30 feet across, maybe 10 feet deep, with a pronounced water-stained dark mineral deposits left by centuries of intermittent seepage. "Come look at it," he said. We walked across the bench. As we got closer, I could see that the alcove floor was smooth sandstone, partially covered with wind-blown sand. There was nothing remarkable about it from a distance. But when we stood at its mouth, Lyle pointed to the back wall. The surface of the sandstone, from about waist height to about 6 feet up, was covered with markings. My first thought was petroglyphs. The Cedar Mesa area is rich with ancestral Pueblo and rock art. I'd seen examples at Natural Bridges, at Butler Wash, in a dozen side canyons. But these weren't petroglyphs. They weren't pecked or incised into the rock. They were drawn or scratched with something that had left thin, shallow grooves in the sandstone surface. And they weren't the typical geometric or representational figures I'd seen in the area. They were lines. Hundreds of them. Thin, parallel, mostly vertical, covering the back wall of the alcove in a dense, uniform pattern. Some were perfectly straight. Others had slight curves or irregularities. But the overall impression was of something deliberate and repetitive, like tally marks, except there was no obvious grouping or counting structure, just lines, dense even, covering every available surface. "I found this in 2009, Lyle said, 3 years after the cattle stopped using the pasture. I'd come down to check the spring development and walked over here to eat lunch, same as we just did. I'd been in this alcove 100 times before. The marks weren't there. I stepped closer. The grooves were shallow, maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep, but clearly incised. They hadn't been painted or drawn with pigment. Something had physically scraped the sandstone surface. I ran my finger along one. It was precise and even, with no variation in depth. The tool, whatever had made it, had maintained consistent pressure across the full length of each line. "You're sure these weren't here before 2006? I said. "I'm sure they weren't here when I was running cattle in this pasture. I used this alcove for shade every time I rode down. If these had been here, I'd have noticed." Could it be recent vandalism? Someone coming through the canyon system? Could be. But who? And why would they scratch 500 straight lines into a wall in a place no one visits? There's no trail down here. The drainage access isn't on any map. I've never seen another boot print. I photographed the markings extensively. Close-ups, wide shots, measurements using my folding ruler for scale. The lines ranged from about 6 inches to nearly 3 feet long. They were clustered most densely in the center of the back wall and became sparser toward the edges. There was no writing, no figures, no symbols I could recognize. Just lines. I noticed something else while photographing. The lines weren't all the same age. Some were sharp and clean, with fresh-looking edges. Others were softened by weathering, their grooves partially filled with wind-blown sand. This suggested they hadn't all been made at the same time. Someone or something had been adding to them over a period of years. "Lyle," I said, "has anyone else seen this?" "Connie. She came down here with me once in 2012. She didn't like it, said it felt wrong, and she wanted to leave." "What about Dr. Wendt, the extension botanist?" "She was here in 2007. The marks were here by then, but I didn't show her. I didn't know what to make of them, and I wasn't ready to explain." "And Dale?" "No." Lyle's voice was flat. "I told Dale about the cattle. That was enough to make him stop asking questions. If I'd shown him this, he'd have had to report it. Cultural resources, potential archaeological site, BLM notification, the whole process. And then people would come. Archaeologists, agency people, maybe public. This is my allotment. It's been my family's ground for 80 years. I don't want it turned into a research site." I understood his reasoning, even though it put me in an uncomfortable position. If these markings were archaeological, if they were pre-contact or even historic, I had a professional obligation to report them. NRCS operates under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Any federal undertaking that might affect cultural resources requires consultation. A compliance review on a grazing allotment was technically a federal undertaking. But I also recognized what I was looking at. These weren't ancestral Puebloan petroglyphs. They weren't historic. They looked recent. And they didn't match any rock art tradition I was familiar with. "I'm not going to report anything today," I said. "But I need to think about what I'm looking at before I decide what to do." Lyle nodded. "That's all I'm asking." We hiked back up the drainage in the early afternoon. The temperature on the benchlands was well over 90 degrees, and the air was perfectly still. Neither of us spoke much during the climb. When we reached the truck, Lyle opened a cooler and handed me a bottle of water. "There's one more thing," he said, sitting on the tailgate. "And then I'll leave it to you." I waited. In 2018, I put a trail camera on a juniper near the spring. Solar-powered, motion-activated. I wanted to know if anyone was coming down into that pasture. I left it there for 14 months. What did it capture? deer, coyotes, a few kit foxes, one mountain lion once. The usual desert wildlife. He paused. But no cattle. I'd release a few yearlings onto the bench to see if they'd stay. Same thing as before, within a couple days they'd be gone. The camera confirmed it. They'd come to the spring, water normally, graze normally. Then, usually on the second night, they'd stop coming to the spring. The next morning, they'd be moving north, altogether out of the pasture. Did the camera capture what happened on that second night? What changed their behavior? That's the thing, Lyle said. The camera was motion activated. It should have captured anything that moved near the spring. On those nights, every single time, there was a gap. Last image of the cattle. Near the spring, usually around dusk. Next image, morning, cattle moving out. Nothing in between. The camera malfunctioned. I thought so. I replaced it once. Same result. I had the first one examined by the guy in Blanding who sells them. He said the trigger mechanism was working fine. The battery was fine. The solar panel was fine. His conclusion was that nothing moved within the detection range during those hours. But the cattle were there. The cattle were there when the camera stopped recording them. And they were gone by morning. I drove back to Monticello with more questions than I'd started with. The cattle avoidance was unusual, but not inexplicable. Animals respond to stimuli humans can't always detect. Subsonic vibration, chemical traces, electromagnetic anomalies near certain mineral deposits. Any of those could produce an avoidance behavior that looked mysterious to an observer who couldn't perceive the cause. The markings were harder to dismiss. Someone had physically altered a rock surface over an extended period, in a location that was genuinely remote and genuinely unvisited. That was a fact. The question was who and why. And the trail camera gap was the kind of detail that sounds eerie when you hear it, but usually has a prosaic explanation. Motion-activated cameras have detection limits. If the cattle were stationary, and the ambient temperature closely matched their body heat, which it could, on a warm desert night, the infrared trigger might not fire. It happened. Not often, but it happened. What I couldn't do was assemble all three of these things into a single explanation that satisfied me. The cattle avoidance, the markings, and the camera gap were three separate observations. They might share a cause, or they might not. The professional thing to do was investigate each one independently before assuming a connection. The following Monday, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the BLM Monticello field office. I asked the realty specialist whether there were any active mining claims, mineral leases, or permitted activities on the gravel bench allotment or the adjacent BLM land. She checked the records and told me no. The area had been extensively prospected for uranium in the 1950s and 1960s, and there were several abandoned exploration roads and drill pads in the wider White Canyon area, but nothing active within the allotment boundary. She added that the area fell within the Bears Ears National Monument boundary and was subject to the monument's mineral withdrawal. The second call was to Dr. Sarah Wendt at USU Extension. She was still there, now a full professor in the Plants, Soils, and Climate Department. I told her I was the new NRCS specialist in Monticello, and that I was reviewing her 2007 rangeland assessment for the Perkins allotment. "Oh," she said. There was something careful in her voice. "I remember that one. Your report was thorough. I have no questions about the vegetation. I'm calling because Mr. Perkins has shown me some markings on a sandstone surface in the east pasture near the spring. Were you aware of those during your visit?" A pause. "He showed you those?" "Yes. He didn't show me. but I saw them. I was doing a vegetative survey in one of the alcoves along the south wall, and I noticed the scratches. I assumed they were recent graffiti or maybe someone sharpening tools. They didn't look archaeological. Did you mention them to Lyle? No. They weren't relevant to my assessment, and I didn't want to create a reporting obligation for something that was probably nothing. There were maybe 30 or 40 lines when I saw them. It wasn't nearly as extensive as you're describing. 30 or 40 in 2007. Something like that. I didn't photograph them. I didn't think they were significant. I told her there were now several hundred, covering most of the back wall. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "I don't have an explanation for that. But I'll tell you something I didn't put in the report because it wasn't data. It was an impression." Go ahead. I was in that pasture for 2 full days. Good weather, good conditions, pleasant work. But both nights, I camped up on the bench above the drainage. And both nights, I didn't sleep well. I had I don't know how to describe it professionally, an unease. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're in a room where something is slightly wrong and you can't identify what it is. I attributed it to being alone in unfamiliar terrain. But I've done solo fieldwork in much more remote places, and I've never had that same feeling. Did you experience anything specific? Sounds, sensations? Nothing I could point to, just a persistent sense that I wanted to leave. And when I did leave, it went away immediately. I remember driving back up to the highway and feeling relief, I suppose, which wasn't like me. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat at my desk for a while, looking at the photographs I'd taken in the alcove. 30 to 40 lines in 2007, several hundred now. That was an ongoing process. A person was returning to that alcove and adding marks. The alternative was not something I was prepared to entertain professionally. But I was also beginning to understand why Dale Hyatt had managed this information the way he had. It wasn't that the problem was trivial. It was that the problem existed in a space between categories. It wasn't a range management issue. It wasn't an archaeological issue. It wasn't a wildlife issue. It was a cluster of observations that didn't belong to any single agency's jurisdiction or expertise. And in a place as vast and understaffed as San Juan County, things that don't belong to anyone's jurisdiction tend to stay unaddressed. I decided to go back. Not with Lyle alone. I needed to spend time in that pasture without a guide, without conversation, without anyone else's interpretation layered over what I was seeing. I told Lyle I was scheduling a follow-up visit to complete the compliance review and asked if he objected to me accessing the pasture on my own. He said he didn't and gave me detailed directions to the drainage head. I went on a Wednesday in mid-April. The weather was clear, temperatures in the mid-70s, with a forecast of no precipitation for 5 days. I parked at the same wide spot, hiked down the drainage, and reached the bench pasture by mid-morning. I had my field kit, my camera, a handheld GPS, and enough water and food for a full day and an overnight if I decided to stay. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter. The bench was roughly triangular canyon walls on 2 sides, the main White Canyon drainage on the 3rd. I measured the fence line, noted the condition of each section, and confirmed that the infrastructure was consistent with what Lyle had described. The fencing had been well built, standard range grade with steel T-posts and 4-strand barbed wire. In several places, the wire was bent outward, not broken, but deformed consistent with sustained pressure from the inside. Cattle pushing against it. Lyle's account of them forcing through was supported by the physical evidence. I walked to the alcove next. The markings were exactly as I'd seen them the previous week. I spent an hour photographing them more carefully this time, using a measuring tape and a color-calibrated scale bar. I counted the lines. There were 437 that I could distinguish clearly, with perhaps another 50 that were too faded or overlapping to count individually. I examined the grooves closely with a hand lens. The cross-section was consistent in all of them, a shallow, flat-bottomed channel with slightly rounded edges. The width was uniform, about 2 millimeters. The tool had been rigid and narrow. A nail, possibly, or a hardened wire. Something metal. I looked for other evidence of human presence in the alcove. I found none. No footprints in the sand, though wind would erase those within days. No litter, no tool marks on the floor, no disturbed vegetation. The approach to the alcove across the bench was open sand and slick rock, and there was no trail. In the late afternoon, I set up camp on the bench about 50 yards from the spring. I chose a spot with a clear line of sight to the alcove and to the main canyon drainage. I ate dinner, reviewed my notes, and settled in for the night. Desert silence is not actually silence. There's always wind, even when you think there's none, a low, baseline movement of air through the canyon system. There are insects, occasionally a nighthawk or an owl. The thermal contraction of sandstone as it cools can produce faint ticking sounds. These are all things I'd heard before, in other places, and they didn't concern me. What I experienced that night was different, and I want to be precise about it. Around 11 o'clock, lying in my sleeping bag on a pad, I became aware of a quality in the air that I can only describe as pressure. Not sound, not wind, not temperature. A physical sensation of compression, as though the atmospheric pressure had increased subtly but distinctly. My ears didn't pop. There was no pain. It was more like the feeling you get when a large vehicle passes you at speed, a displacement of air that you feel in your chest before you hear it. It lasted about 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I sat up and looked around. The sky was brilliantly clear. Natural Bridges is the world's first certified international dark sky park, and the canyon country around it is equally dark. I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. Nothing had visibly changed. No movement, no sound. About 20 minutes later, the same sensation occurred. Same quality, same duration. This time I was sitting up and alert, and I noticed that it seemed directional, originating from the south, from the direction of the alcove and the canyon wall behind it. It happened 3 more times over the next hour, at roughly 15 to 20-minute intervals. Each time, the same quality. Each time, from the same direction. After the 5th occurrence, it stopped. I lay awake for another 2 hours and experienced nothing further. In the morning, I walked to the alcove. I'm going to describe what I saw as precisely as I can, because precision matters here, and I do not want to overstate anything. There were new lines on the wall. Not many, perhaps 8 or 10, clustered near the right edge of the existing pattern, where the density was lowest. They were fresh. The edges were sharp. There was no sand in the grooves. I had been 50 yards away all night. I had not slept deeply. I had not heard footsteps, conversation, or the sound of a tool on stone. I stood in the alcove for a long time that morning. I counted the new lines 3 times to make sure I wasn't confusing them with marks I'd already documented. I had my photographs from the previous afternoon, GPS tagged, time-stamped. I compared them against what I was seeing. 8 new lines, all on the right side of the panel, all within a section I had photographed at 4:47 p.m. the previous day. In those photographs, the section was bare stone. Now it wasn't. I photographed the new marks from the same angles, using the same scale bar. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I pressed my palm flat against the back wall of the alcove, near the center of the marked area. The stone was cool, normal for a north-facing surface in early morning shade. But there was something else. A faint vibration. Not a buzz or a hum. More like the feeling you get when you touch a pipe that's carrying water somewhere deep inside a building. A resonance traveling through the rock from somewhere else. I held my hand there for about 30 seconds. The vibration was continuous and steady. When I stepped back and put my hand on the alcove floor, I didn't feel it. Only the back wall. Only in the area where the marks were densest. I left the pasture that morning. I didn't rush, but I didn't linger. I hiked up the drainage in full daylight, reached my truck by 10, and drove back to the highway. I want to be clear that I didn't leave because I was afraid. I left because I had data photographs, timestamps, physical observations, and I needed to sit with them somewhere quiet before I made any decisions about what to do next. On the drive back to Monticello, I tried to work through the possibilities systematically. The new marks had appeared overnight. I had been present. I had not heard them being made. The simplest explanation was that I had miscounted the previous afternoon or misidentified the section I'd photographed. And the marks were already there. This was the explanation I wanted to be true. But my photographs were unambiguous. I'd placed the scale bar directly on the section that was now marked. The before and after comparison left no room for miscounting. The next simplest explanation was that someone had entered the alcove during the night, made the marks, and left without my detecting them. This was physically possible. I'd been 50 yards away, and although I'd been awake through most of the night, there were periods, particularly after the pressure sensations stopped, when I might have dozed. The alcove was approachable from below, along the base of the canyon wall, and a careful person moving on sandstone would make very little noise. This explanation required a human being with a specific tool, knowledge of the alcove, willingness to work in complete darkness, and a reason to add 8 lines to a panel of 437. It also required them to have done this without leaving a single footprint in the sand between the alcove and the canyon wall. I checked for footprints before I left. There were none other than mine and Lyle's from the previous week, both of which were partially eroded by wind. The approach to the alcove from the bench was across a 30-yard stretch of soft sand. My own prints from that morning were clearly visible. There were no others. The third explanation, I'll state it plainly, was that I didn't know what had made the marks. That no one did. That 18 years of cattle avoidance, a growing field of unexplained lines on a sandstone wall, a trail camera that went dark at the wrong moments, and a pressure sensation felt by a trained observer in the middle of the night collectively pointed towards something I couldn't categorize. I'm a rangeland management specialist. My job is soil, grass, water, and livestock. I'm not an archaeologist, a geologist, or a physicist. I know the limits of my expertise, but I also know what constitutes reliable observation within my own discipline. And I was confident in what I documented. When I got back to the office, I called Lyle. I told him I'd spent the night on the bench and that I'd observed new marks in the alcove that had appeared overnight. I told him about the pressure sensation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Connie felt that too, in 2012. She described it as a pushing feeling in her chest. Did you feel it?" "No, not that time." But I've been down there at dusk a few times, checking the spring, and I've felt something similar. I always assumed it was, I don't know, some kind of geological thing. Underground water, maybe, or the rocks settling. Has it gotten stronger over the years? I think so. I can't be sure because I haven't been down there consistently. But the last time I felt it, about 4 years ago, it was distinct enough that I cut my visit short. You mentioned you hadn't told Dale about the markings. Did you tell him about this? No, I told him about the cattle. That was the practical problem. I was losing use of a pasture I was paying a permit for. The rest of it was personal. I didn't think anyone would take it seriously. And I didn't want to be the old rancher telling ghost stories. You're not telling ghost stories, Lyle. You're describing physical observations. The marks are real. I photographed them. The cattle behavior is documented. These are things that can be investigated. By who? It was a fair question, and it brought me to the decision I'd been circling since I first sat down at my desk in Monticello. The institutional response to this situation, the correct, procedural, by-the-book response, was a cultural resource notification to BLM, followed by an archaeological survey, followed by a determination of eligibility for the National Register, followed by a management plan. That process would take months or years, would bring people onto Lyle's allotment that he didn't want there, and would almost certainly focus on the markings as a potential archaeological site while ignoring the cattle behavior, the camera data, and the sensory observations that provided the actual context. The alternative was to do what Dale had done. Manage the information quietly, keep the files clean, let Lyle keep his privacy and his allotment, accept that some things don't have explanations, and move on. Neither option felt right. The first would generate a process that was almost certainly wrong for the situation. The second would perpetuate exactly the kind of institutional silence that had left me without context when I'd arrived. So I chose a third path. I called someone I trusted. Her name was Marion Koss. We'd overlapped at the NRCS Training Center in Fort Worth in 2019 during an advanced soils workshop. Marion was a soil scientist stationed in Moab, about 90 miles north of Monticello, working on watershed assessments for the upper Colorado River Basin. She was sharp, careful, and importantly, she was the kind of person who could look at an ambiguous situation and resist the urge to force it into a category before the evidence supported one. I'd kept in touch with her loosely over the years. A few emails, a shared publication, an occasional phone call when one of us had a technical question the other could answer. I called her on a Thursday evening, after work hours, and told her the whole thing. All of it. The cattle, the markings, the camera, the pressure, the new lines appearing overnight. Dale's managed silence, Lyle's reluctance. I didn't editorialize. I gave her the data. When I finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "You photographed the wall before and after?" "Yes. Same angles, same scale bar, GPS tagged and time-stamped. And the vibration in the rock, you felt it with your hand. On the back wall only, not the floor, not the sides. Continuous while I was touching it." "What's the geology of that wall? You said Cedar Mesa sandstone?" "Yes. Permian-Aeolian cross-bedded, fine-grained, standard for the area. Any faulting nearby? Joints, fractures, evidence of subsurface water movement?" The spring is about 200 yards west of the alcove at the base of the same wall. Seepage from a contact zone, probably. I didn't observe any major fracture systems in the alcove itself. But I'm not a structural geologist. "I want to come see it," she said. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected professional interest, Maybe some suggestions for who to contact. Not a willingness to drive 90 miles and hike into a canyon on someone else's allotment. "Are you sure?" I said. "This is outside your job description." "It's outside yours too. But you went back and spent the night. Why?" "Because the data was incomplete." "Exactly." I called Lyle the next morning and asked if he'd be willing to let me bring a colleague, a soil scientist, not an archaeologist, not BLM, to see the pasture. He thought about it for a full day before calling me back. "Connie thinks I should," he said. "She says I've been sitting on this alone too long. Bring your friend. But I want to be there." We went on a Saturday in early May, all three of us. Marion drove down from Moab and met us at Lyle's ranch. I'd briefed her thoroughly, but I deliberately hadn't shown her the photographs. I wanted her to see the alcove without preconceptions. The hike in was the same. The weather was clear, warmer than my previous visit. Lyle led us down the drainage with the same steady, practiced pace. He and Marion talked easily. She asked about the ranch, the water situation, the grazing history. He answered with the same precision I'd noticed in our first meeting. By the time we reached the bench, they'd established the kind of professional mutual respect that develops quickly between people who both work with land for a living. Marion spent the first hour doing what she always does, walking, observing, not talking much. She examined the soil surface across the bench, kicked at the cryptobiotic crust in a few places, knelt at the spring, and tasted the water. She looked at the bent fencing without me pointing it out. She walked the full length of the south-facing wall before approaching the alcove. When she stepped inside and saw the markings, she stopped. She stood still for maybe 30 seconds. Then she set down her pack and got to work. She spent 2 hours in that alcove. She photographed the markings, measured the groove dimensions with a micrometer she'd brought, took small samples of the sand that had accumulated in some of the older grooves. And this was the part I hadn't thought to do. She placed a stethoscope against the back wall. Not a medical stethoscope, a geophone, a contact microphone designed for detecting subsurface vibrations. She carried one as part of her standard field kit for soil assessments, where it was used to locate subsurface water flow and identify soil density variations. She placed it at 3 points on the back wall. At the first 2, near the edges, where the markings were sparse, she listened for about 30 seconds each and shook her head slightly. At the 3rd point center of the panel, where the marks were densest, she went still. She kept the geophone against the wall for nearly 3 minutes. Then she removed it, replaced it, listened again. She did this 4 times. "There's something," she said. "Vibration?" I asked. "Rhythmic. Very low frequency. Below what you'd normally hear, but the geophone is picking it up clearly." She paused. "It's not water. Water through rock sounds like a continuous broadband noise. Rushing. This is periodic. A pulse. Maybe every 15 to 18 seconds. "I felt something like that with my hand against the wall," I said. "My first night here. This is consistent with what you described, but it's more distinct through the geophone." She looked at me. "I'm not a geophysicist. I can tell you what this isn't. It isn't water, it isn't wind loading, and it isn't thermal expansion. The periodicity is too regular for any of those. What could produce a periodic low-frequency vibration through sandstone? Seismic activity, but there's no active faulting in this area significant enough to produce a continuous signal. Industrial activity, mining, drilling, but there's nothing operating within miles. Cavern resonance, potentially, if there's a large subsurface void that's being excited by some external energy source." She straightened up, That last one is the most plausible to me, geologically. Cedar Mesa sandstone is soluble along certain bedding planes. The karst features in this area are well documented. Natural Bridges itself is a product of that process. A large enough subsurface cavity could produce a resonant frequency if it were being driven by something. Wind channeling through a narrow aperture, for instance. A natural pipe organ effect. But you said the pattern was too regular for wind. It is. Wind-driven resonance would vary with surface conditions, gusts, direction changes, temperature differentials. This signal was constant the entire time I was listening. Same interval, same amplitude, like a heartbeat. She said that last word and then seemed to hear herself. She shook her head. I mean metronomically regular, consistent. I don't want to anthropomorphize. Lyle had been standing outside the alcove, watching us. He hadn't entered it. I noticed this, but didn't remark on it. You've heard enough, he said. Marion looked at him. Mr. Perkins, how much do you want to know about what's happening on your allotment? I've been living next to it for 20 years. I want to know what drove my cattle out of a pasture my family used for 60 years. I want to know who's marking up that wall. And I want to know whether it's going to stay contained in that drainage, or if it's going to become a problem for the rest of my operation. Those are practical questions, Marion said. I can help with some of them, but the answers I have right now are going to be partial. Partial is more than I've had. We ate lunch on the bench, in the open, away from the alcove. Marion laid out what she could say with confidence. The vibration was real, measurable, and anomalous. It was not produced by any standard geological process she could identify in the field. It was localized to the back wall of the alcove, which suggested the source was behind or beneath the wall, rather than propagating through the broader rock formation. The markings were physically consistent with a metal tool being drawn across sandstone with consistent pressure. And the variation in weathering confirmed that they had been made over an extended period years, not months. What she could not say was what connected these things, or whether they were connected at all. The vibration might have nothing to do with the markings. The markings might have nothing to do with the cattle. 3 separate phenomena occurring in the same location is suggestive, but suggestion is not evidence. I want to bring a geophone array, she said. 4 or 5 units, placed across the back wall and on the surrounding rock surface, recording continuously for 48 to 72 hours. That would let us characterize the signal properly: frequency, amplitude, directionality, variation over time. Right now, I'm working with a 3-minute sample through a contact mic. That's not data. That's an impression. Lyle looked at me. Would that mean more people? Just Marion, I said. And me. Same arrangement as today. He thought about it. All right. But I want to know what you find before anyone else does. Agreed. We hiked out that afternoon. On the drive back to Monticello, Marion called me from her truck. I need to tell you something I didn't want to say in front of Lyle, she said. Okay. When I was listening through the geophone at the center of the panel, the 3rd contact point, the pulse was 15 to 18 seconds apart, like I said. But there was a secondary signal underneath it, much fainter. I almost missed it. What kind of signal? Irregular. Not periodic like the pulse, more like scratching. A light, rapid scratching, like the sound a nail makes on stone. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I'm going to say this once, she said, and then I'm going to set it aside until we have better data. What I heard through that wall sounded like the thing that made those marks, happening on the other side of the rock. I let that sit. Could it have been an animal? Something burrowing? In sandstone? Nothing burrows through Cedar Mesa sandstone. It's lithified quartz. You'd need a steel tool. Or something harder than the rock. Yes, or something harder than the rock. We scheduled the geophone deployment for the 3rd week of May. Marianne requisitioned the equipment through her Moab office, 4 portable geophones with data loggers, battery packs rated for 72 hours, and weatherproof housings. She framed the requisition as a subsurface hydrology assessment, which was technically within her duties and not untrue. There was a spring, and she was investigating what was beneath the surface. I spent the intervening weeks doing my regular work and trying not to think about the alcove constantly. I was not entirely successful. At night, in my rental apartment in Monticello, I'd look at the photographs on my laptop, the before and after of the walls section, the precise parallel lines, the geophone readout Marian had saved from her initial recording. I'd think about what she'd heard through the rock. Scratching. A sound consistent with the marks being made. On the other side of the wall, I also thought about Dale Hyatt, his managed silence, his pencil note, "Ask Lyle about the east pasture." Not again, not again. I read that differently now. Not as exasperation with a recurring problem, but as a decision. A man encountering something he didn't want to encounter a second time. I called Dale. His number was in the personnel file, and I'd been avoiding it for weeks. But the geophone deployment was approaching, and I wanted to know what he knew before we went back. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was thinner than I expected, and he coughed several times during the conversation. I introduced myself, explained that I'd taken his position, and said I was conducting a compliance review on the Perkins allotments. "How's Lyle?" he asked. "He's fine. He's been cooperative. He's shown me the east pasture on the gravel bench allotment." Silence. "Mr. Hyatt, I found your pencil note in the 2019 field file. Ask Lyle about the east pasture. Not again." "Can you tell me what that referred to?" A long pause. "You've been down there?" "Yes." "Did you see the wall?" "Yes." "Then you know what 'not again' means." His voice was quiet but not evasive. "I saw those marks in 2008. There were maybe 200 of them then. I asked Lyle about them, and he told me about the cattle. I walked the pasture, I looked at the spring, I looked at the wall, and I made a decision. I decided it wasn't something NRCS was equipped to deal with. I wasn't going to trigger a cultural resource review for something that wasn't cultural. I wasn't going to file a geological report for something I couldn't classify geologically. And I wasn't going to put my name on a document that described something I couldn't explain, because in this agency, that document follows you. I understand that reasoning. In 2019, I went back for the utilization review. The marks had doubled. More than doubled. The whole back wall was covered. I stood in that alcove, and I felt you felt it too, didn't you? The pressure. Yes. I drove home that night, and I wrote "not again" in the margin because I needed to write something somewhere. I needed one piece of paper in one file that acknowledged what I'd seen. But I wasn't going to investigate further. I wasn't going to bring anyone else into it. I was 59 years old, 4 years from retirement, and I had spent my entire career doing good work for the ranchers in this county. I wasn't going to end it by becoming the man who couldn't explain a wall full of scratches in a canyon nobody visits. I'm not judging you, Dale. I know, but I judged myself. That's part of why I retired early. The medical issue was real. I've got COPD, I'm on oxygen at night, but I could have stayed another year. I chose not to, because every spring, when the utilization reviews came around, I'd have to decide whether to go back to that pasture or skip it again. And every year I skipped it. I knew the marks were still growing. I asked him one more question. In all the years you were in that office, did anyone else, BLM, the monument staff, any other agency, ever mention anything unusual about the White Canyon drainage? Anything at all? He thought about it. Once, around 2015, a seasonal ranger at Natural Bridge's young woman, I don't remember her name, came into the Monticello BLM office asking about seismic monitoring in the area. She said she'd been working at the Awachomo Bridge overlook and had noticed what she described as a rhythmic tremor in the observation railing, very faint, happened in the late evening and stopped by midnight. She wanted to know if there was active seismic monitoring that might explain it. What did BLM tell her? They told her the closest seismic station was at the University of Utah network, and the nearest node was in Hanksville, 60 miles away. They said minor tremors were common in the region due to ongoing salt tectonics in the Paradox Basin. She seemed satisfied. I only heard about it secondhand. But Awachomo Bridge is what, 3 miles from the head of the White Canyon system? Maybe less. It's about 2 miles. 2 miles. He coughed. I never followed up. I never connected it. But you just did, didn't you? I told him I appreciated his time and that I'd let him know if I learned anything definitive. He wished me luck. Before he hung up, he said one more thing. The marks on that wall, when I saw them in 2008, some of them were deep, deeper than a person would make with a casual scratch. They were incised, purposeful, and they were even, regular, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times. He paused. I've been around livestock my whole life. You know how cattle will rub against a post back and forth, wearing grooves into the wood? The rhythm of it, the repetition, those marks reminded me of that. Something doing the same thing over and over, because the action itself was the point. He hung up. The geophone deployment happened on May 20th. Marion and I hiked in with Lyle, carrying the equipment in frame packs. We mounted the 4 geophones on the back wall of the alcove using a mineral-safe adhesive that wouldn't damage the rock's surface, spacing them at roughly even intervals across the marked area. We placed a 5th unit on the alcove floor as a control. Each unit was connected to a standalone data logger set to record continuously at a sample rate of 500 Hz, sensitive enough to capture signals well below the threshold of human hearing. We activated the array at 2 p.m. and planned to retrieve it 72 hours later. Lyle chose not to stay. Marion and I camped on the bench, same spot I'd used before. That first night, I felt the pressure again. Same quality, same directionality. Marion, lying in her own sleeping bag 15 feet from mine, said quietly, "There it is. You feel it? Like someone leaning on my sternum. Very gentle, very steady." It came and went in the same pattern, episodes lasting 10 to 20 seconds, spaced 15 to 20 minutes apart, occurring between roughly 10:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., then stopping. In the morning, we checked the alcove. 4 new lines, fresh, sharp-edged, on the right side of the panel. Marion photographed them without speaking. We spent the day working on the bench. She took soil samples. I completed the rest of the compliance transects that would justify the visit in my official records. In the afternoon, we sat near the spring, and Marion said something that changed how I thought about all of it. "I've been looking at the distribution of the lines," she said. "Not the individual marks, the overall pattern, the way they're distributed across the wall." "What about it?" "They're not random, but they're not organized in any symbolic or representational way either. There's no writing, no counting, no figures. The pattern is spatial. The densest concentration is in the center of the wall, and it decreases toward the edges. The newest marks are always on the periphery. The pattern is expanding outward. Yes, from a central point, like growth, like the way lichen colonizes a rock surface or the way a root system radiates from a trunk. It's centrifugal. You're saying it looks biological. I'm saying the distribution pattern is consistent with biological growth models. That doesn't mean it is biological. It means whatever process is adding lines to this wall is doing so in a way that follows the same spatial logic as a living system expanding into available space. I looked at the wall. 440-odd lines, growing outward from a center, getting denser, getting larger. Marion, what if it isn't someone on this side of the wall? She looked at me. I told you what I heard through the geophone. I know. I'm asking what you think. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I think there is a subsurface cavity behind that wall. I think something inside that cavity is producing a periodic low-frequency vibration. I think the markings on the exterior surface are physically produced by an agent or process originating from behind the rock, not in front of it. And I think the cattle can detect the vibration at frequencies or intensities that humans can't normally perceive. And they respond to it by leaving. What's producing the vibration? I don't know. I have hypotheses that are geological, and I have hypotheses that aren't. The geological ones are more comfortable. But the scratching sound, I heard the irregular scratching under the pulse. That isn't geological. Geological processes don't scratch. We stayed 2 more nights. Each morning, new lines. 4 the second night, 6 the third. Always on the edges, always fresh. Always made without a sound we could hear from 50 yards away. On the morning we retrieved the geophones, Marion downloaded the data in the field onto her laptop. The full analysis would take weeks. But even the raw waveform display showed what she expected. My to a clear, periodic, low-frequency signal, strongest at the center of the array, weakest at the edges and on the floor control. The signal was present continuously during the nighttime hours and attenuated during the day, though it never fully disappeared. And there, embedded in the primary signal, was the secondary pattern. Irregular, high-frequency bursts, brief, sharp, and clustered. They occurred exclusively during the nighttime hours. They occurred exclusively at the center channel. And when Marion cross-referenced their timing against our photographic record, they occurred during the same period when the new marks appeared. We packed out in silence. On the bench above the drainage, with the truck in sight, Marion stopped. I'm going to write this up, she said. Properly. As a subsurface geophysical anomaly with surface expression. I'm going to submit it through my office as an addendum to the watershed assessment. It'll go into the system as a recommendation for further investigation by someone with the right expertise, a geophysicist, ideally someone with karst experience. And the markings? I'm going to describe them as surface features of unknown origin associated with a geophysical anomaly. That's accurate. That's defensible. That's careful. It needs to be careful, because whatever is behind that wall, geological process, unknown organism, something neither of us has a framework for, it's been there for at least 20 years, and it's been growing. If I sensationalize this, it gets dismissed. If I document it conservatively, it gets investigated. I respected that. It was the approach I would have taken. It was, in a different way, the approach Dale had taken, except Marion was pushing the information into the system instead of holding it back. I drove Lyle home that afternoon and sat with him and Connie at the kitchen table. I told them what we'd found. as plainly as I could. The vibration was real and measurable. The marks appeared to be connected to a subsurface process. The cattle avoidance was almost certainly a response to the low-frequency signal. Marion would be recommending further investigation through official channels, but it would be framed as a geological study, not an archaeological one. No one would be reclassifying his allotment or turning his pasture into a tourist attraction. Lyle listened to everything. Then he looked at Connie. Something passed between them again, the same unspoken exchange I'd noticed the first time. Connie said, "So there's something in the rock." "There appears to be a subsurface feature that's producing a detectable signal," I said. "We don't know what kind of feature. But it's making those marks. The data suggests the marks are associated with the signal, yes. And it's been getting bigger." I didn't answer immediately, because she was right. And the implications of that were something I'd been turning over in my mind for weeks. The marks were expanding outward. The signal was detectable at the surface. The cattle animals with a detection threshold more sensitive than ours had abandoned the pasture nearly 20 years ago. Whatever this process was, it was not static. "Yes," I said. "The pattern is expanding." Connie looked at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. Not fear, not curiosity. Something closer to recognition, like a person who has long suspected something and has finally heard it confirmed. "It's coming through," she said. Neither Lyle nor I responded. There was nothing to say to that because she hadn't asked a question. She'd stated what the evidence, stripped of professional caution, plainly suggested. Marion's report went into the NRCS system in June. It was technically sound, conservatively framed, and recommended a geophysical survey by qualified specialists. As of my last conversation with her, the recommendation had been received by the BLM Monticello field office and forwarded to the state office in Salt Lake City. It had not been acted on. This isn't unusual. Recommendations for non-emergency field investigations in southeastern Utah compete with wildfire response, grazing conflicts, energy development, monument management, and a dozen other priorities. It might be funded this fiscal year. It might not be funded for 5. I completed the compliance review for all 3 Perkins allotments. For the Gravel Bench East pasture, I recorded the utilization as 0 no livestock use and noted the voluntary rest period initiated by the permit holder. I described the range condition as excellent, which it was. In the remarks section I wrote, "Subsurface geophysical anomaly documented in East pasture. See associated report by M. Koss, NRCS Moab. Recommend continued monitoring pending specialist evaluation." It was honest. It was in the system. It was more than Dale had done, and less than the situation probably required. I still work in Monticello. I drive past the Highway 95 junction twice a week. I haven't been back to the East pastures since May. Marion calls me occasionally. She's analyzed the geophone data more thoroughly now, and she tells me the primary signal, the pulse, has a frequency of 3.2 hertz. That's well below human hearing. It's within the range that's been documented to cause feelings of unease, chest pressure, and anxiety in controlled studies. Infrasound, the kind of vibration generated by earthquakes, volcanic activity, large machinery, and certain atmospheric conditions. Or by something resonating in a cavity behind a sandstone wall in a canyon in southeastern Utah that no one visits. The secondary signal, the scratching, she's less willing to characterize. She says the waveform is consistent with a physical object being drawn across a stone surface. She says the amplitude and duration of each burst correlates with the length and depth of the new marks that appeared during our deployment. She says the simplest interpretation of the data is that the marks are being made from behind the wall. She also says that the wall at the center of the marked area is approximately 14 inches thick. She measured it using the signal propagation delay between the exterior geophone and the estimated source point. 14 inches of Cedar Mesa sandstone between the alcove and whatever is on the other side. She told me that number in a flat, professional voice. Then she said, "The older marks near the center are deeper than the newer ones on the edges, by about 1 millimeter. The wall is thinner where the work has been going on longest." Yes. I think about Connie's words. It's coming through. I think about the 450 marks on that wall, or however many there are now, because I have not been back and the process has not stopped. I think about the pulse, the scratch, the cattle who knew before anyone else that something had changed in a place where nothing was supposed to change. I don't know what's behind that wall. Marion doesn't know. Lyle doesn't know. The BLM doesn't know, and won't know until someone with the right equipment and the right authorization and the right funding goes down into that drainage and finds out. But here's what I keep coming back to. The thing I haven't been able to set aside since that night on the bench when the pressure came in slow waves from the south wall. I've worked with ranchers for over a decade. I've watched cattle respond to threats, to weather, to predators, to bad water, to toxic plants. When cattle encounter something dangerous, they avoid it. They move away. Lyle's cattle didn't just move away. They moved in the same direction, together, calmly, without panic. They moved the way animals move when they understand something, not startled, not confused, decided. Whatever is happening in that east pasture, the cattle made their decision about it almost 20 years ago. They chose to leave, and they never went back. I think about that. And I think about 14 inches of sandstone. And I think about marks that are 1 millimeter deeper where they've been made the longest. And I wonder when the rest of us will be as smart as the cattle were.